that I'm doing is about Avalokitesvara and the jewel in the lotus. And it's a talk about suffering and how we respond to suffering. And just in case that sounds like a bit of a downer, it's also about the key to happiness that enables us to deal with suffering. So we're in the middle of a series of talks about symbols, myths and stories. And you'll be pleased to know that you're going to get all three tonight. So you're going to hear quite a lot about the symbolism of the archetypal bodhisattva Avalokitesvara. You're going to hear the myth associated with Avalokitesvara. And you're also going to hear a story set in a Second World War prison camp. So, and I'm going to start with something completely different. I'm going to start with something that Kamasiri said in a discussion group last week. Kamasiri said that when she first went on her very first retreat to Taraloka Retreat Centre, she was talking to Sadhanandi, who's the chairwoman at Taraloka. And one of the things that she said to Sadhanandi was, well, what sort of people come here? What sort of people want to get involved in Buddhism? And Sadhanandi said to her, well, there are two sorts of people, really. There are people who really know what it is to suffer, people who have really been through it and had all sorts of very difficult things happen to them. So they really know about suffering. And then there are the people who've, well, pretty much got it all, actually. They've got all the things that anyone might want in terms of jobs, relationships, money, and so on and so on. But actually, they know that that's not enough. And they're looking for something else. They're looking for meaning in their lives. And, well, I was quite struck by that, because it's quite a dramatic way of saying, well, why do people get interested in Buddhism? Why do people keep coming along once they've heard about Buddhism? And actually, you might identify with either of those, or more likely, you're somewhere in a spectrum in between the two, and certainly that's where I am. But I thought there was food for thought there. And, well, myself, actually, as I said, I think I'd probably put on a spectrum, somewhere in the spectrum between the lots of suffering and they got it all. I certainly wouldn't say I had it all, but I regard myself as quite fortunate. I haven't had a huge amount of traumas or tragedies in my life, but just the usual share of human suffering. Parents dying, divorce, difficulties, working constantly with samskaras that I find difficult to shift. The usual quota of probably, resentments, anxieties and other negative mental states, all of which is suffering. But recently I've been noticing how I feel when I notice other people are having a hard time. Not that I didn't notice it before, but I seem to be noticing it much more recently than I had in the past. And just a couple of examples of that. The first is my next-door neighbour, our next-door neighbour, Joyce. And Joyce is a very old lady. She's 87. And she's got a very ageing body. In particular, her legs are very painful and her knees don't really hold her up. She can't rely on them any longer. They give her a lot of pain. And she can't really walk without being able to lean on something for support. And that makes her fearful of falling. And actually, she's got very, very fearful of the world. She thinks there's a big threatening world out there. And, well, I can't really do anything to ease her pain. I can't make her younger, can't replace her knees. And my response to her suffering is one of frustration. I mean, there are practical things that I can do to make her life easier, and I do as many of those as I can. But actually, even then, it's quite difficult to help her because she's stubbornly independent. She insists that she can carry the shopping bags and that she doesn't want taking to Morrison's unless I happen to be going anyway. And so on. You know, she resists my attempts to help her, and that's very frustrating as well. And yeah, another example is, well, the news. So just to take this morning's example, shortly before I started writing my talk, I had a look at the news, and the headlines were about violence in Northern Ireland. And my heart just sank, because I thought, well, after nearly a century of violence and hatred in Northern Ireland, they've got a sort of fragile peace. And now there are people who, when they don't get what they want and what they think should happen, respond with blazing barricades and petrol bombs. And it just makes me feel helpless, actually. I just want to do something about that situation. I just feel that frustration really, well, I find it very painful. So just two very ordinary examples of dukkha, and there are loads of them. There are loads of them that in your life, there are loads of them in the world. Yeah, and of course, when you came on your introductory courses, and you did the famous session about the Wheel of Life, and you learned about the famous, or perhaps the infamous gap, then you learned that there are different ways that we respond to suffering. We might not have described it as suffering then, but, you know, we said, okay, you feel a feeling that you don't like, what do you do? And there are probably two things that you do. And probably you do both of them at times, and you might do one more than the other. But here are the things that I do. One of them is I go to craving. I think, okay, this is a bit painful. Let's have a bar of chocolate, or let's have a glass of wine and a nice meal, or let's have a game of Scrabble, or let's get down and really absorb myself in some spreadsheets. That might be quite deviant behaviour, but one of my refuges. It'll, you know, there are lots of variants on that. So we go to craving for TV, for internet surfing, for sex, for all sorts of pleasant sensation, just to mask the suffering. So that's one of the responses to suffering. And the other one, which I can also do, is I go to blaming. Blaming the terrorists, blaming the IRA, blaming the government, blaming other people, or just plain anger, frustration, and a kind of tension. So, well, there it is, actually. Two responses to suffering. Either craving or blaming. And actually, depending on... Yes, craving and blaming. And actually, if we go more to craving, then we might be greed types. And if we go more to blaming, then we might be hate types. And I've always thought I was greed type, but actually, recently, I realise how much I go to frustration and a kind of pent-up anger, actually, in the face of suffering in the world. So I think I do both. You might too. You might like to think about which you go to first. Okay, so two ways that we might respond to suffering. But there is a third way. And the myth of Avalokitesvara is about the third way of responding to suffering. So, Avalokitesvara. This is just one image of him. He's probably the best known of the bodhisattvas. He's part of many, many Buddhist traditions. He's even recognised in parts of Theravadan Sri Lanka, where they don't really go in for different Buddhas and bodhisattvas very much. If you've travelled in the Himalayas, then you've probably seen his mantra painted along the walls as you approach a village in the mountains. And you might have seen his mantra on prayer wheels and prayer flags. And actually, just this weekend, we chanted it several times on the Duke's Barn retreat. So Avalokitesvara is the archetypal bodhisattva of compassion. And he represents how an enlightened being responds to the suffering of the world. So the myth is, the archetype is that he's working tirelessly for the benefit of all beings. And there are various forms of Avalokitesvara, and some of them are quite normal looking with only two arms. Many of them have 4 arms. There are some with 8 arms. And then there is a very common but slightly bizarre form with 1,000 arms and 11 heads. And that's the form that we've got here on this tanka. So, so now we come to the myth. The myth of how Avalokitesvara comes to have 1,000 arms and 11 heads. So briefly, many years ago, when Avalokitesvara was a trainee bodhisattva, probably, he became distressed by the terrible suffering in the world. All the usual sufferings of sickness and old age and death, but then sufferings because of natural disasters, sufferings because of war, sufferings because of the sort of physical suffering that people endure because of sickness and injury, emotional suffering, psychological suffering, just all the sufferings. And Avalokitesvara felt it very deeply. He really, really wanted to help. He really, really wanted to be able to stop beings from suffering. But the scale of the suffering of the world was just so great that his frustration became greater and greater. His sort of pent-up tension just got more and more intense until suddenly, under the strain, his head blasted into 11 pieces and the rest of his body shattered into 1,000 bits. And the legend goes that Avalokitesvara's form was put together again by Amitabha, the Buddha of compassion. And he put Avalokitesvara together in a form that was going to make him far more able to help suffering beings in the world. So he gave him 11 heads, so that Avalokitesvara could see in all directions. He could just be on the lookout for whoever was suffering, so that he could respond to them as quickly as possible. And he made the 1,000 pieces of his body into 1,000 arms that were just stretching out into all directions and made him far more capable of being able to help many, many more beings, to alleviate suffering of many more beings. And the most important thing that he did was to place in Avalokitesvara's hand the wish-fulfilling jewel. And you can see that in the centre, next to his heart, Avalokitesvara's central pair of hands are holding this wish-fulfilling jewel, the Chintamani. And the Chintamani means the wish-fulfilling jewel. And so Avalokitesvara has been put together, arranged around something that is of central importance to him, something that holds the key to responding to the sufferings of the world. So, well, first of all, I can really relate to that story. I can really relate to Avalokitesvara's tension. It's a bit like my frustration with Joyce. It's a bit like everybody's frustration when they hear the news about war and cruelty and other suffering going on. My response to Joyce is partly compassion. I really do want to stop her from suffering. But partly, actually, it's self-concern. I want to stop my own suffering in relation to her. I want things to be different, that's the thing. I really want there not to be old age and sickness and death. I want to stop the way things really are. I just want them to stop. So my compassion is actually tainted with ego. It's tainted with wanting something different and wanting my own discomfort in Joyce's suffering to stop. Avalokitesvara's problem was much subtler. His wanting to save all beings was, though, subtly tainted with ego. And really it was only when his being was reorganised around something that was much bigger, much higher than himself, something transcendental, that he was genuinely able to help others and to experience peace of mind himself while he did that. So for Avalokitesvara, the wish-fulfilling jewel is the key to responding to the suffering of the world. The jewel, the Chintamani, that he holds next to his heart represents the bodhicitta, And the bodhicitta, most of you will have come across before. Two parts to the word. Bodhi is enlightenment, and chitta is sometimes translated as heart and sometimes as mind. So the bodhicitta is sometimes translated as the will to enlightenment, the thought of enlightenment, but I think but probably more accurately is the aspiration to enlightenment, the heartfelt wish for enlightenment. And what Avalokitesvara is wishing for is he's wishing for enlightenment for all beings. That's what he's holding to the centre of his heart, because he realises that only enlightenment, only something transcendental, is actually going to solve the sufferings of the world. So yes, okay, the bodhicitta, the determination to achieve enlightenment for all beings. And in a way, that wish is the same wish as Avalokitesvara had before his body shattered. It's the same wish, but it's purified of the frustration that taints most of our strong wishing, and that's the taint of ego. And because the taint of ego is gone, that little bit of wanting things to be different for myself, because that taint of ego has gone for Avalokitesvara, the tension has gone too. And all that remains is pure metta, just pure warmth, just pure positive emotion, the purest of wishes, the purest altruism, purest well-wishing for all beings, ourselves included, but not putting ourselves first in the way that we normally do. So that's the wish that Avalokitesvara holds to his heart, and it's the wish at the heart of Buddhism too. So we could say that the bodhicitta is the third way of responding to suffering. So, okay, we've had craving and blaming. Maybe we could put the bodhicitta as the third way of responding to dukkha or suffering. But that might seem quite tall order. So let's just have a look at a couple of other bits of symbolism about the figure of Avalokitesvara, and perhaps we'll come back to dukkha. So there are two other symbols that characterise figures of Avalokitesvara, two other symbols that Avalokitesvara always appears with. One of them is a mala. In his right hand, Avalokitesvara, one of his right hands, Avalokitesvara holds a mala. And on the mala, he's counting off the beings that he's managed to save, the beings that he's managed to bring to enlightenment. And in his other hand, in his left hand, he holds a lotus. Now, you might have noticed that there are a lot of lotuses in Buddhism. Buddhism bodhisattvas sit on lotuses. There are lotuses in all sorts of Buddhist art. And the symbol of the lotus refers back to the story about the Buddha shortly after his enlightenment having a vision of human beings as lotuses, seeing a whole lot of lotuses at different stages of development, in the mud, growing up through the water, peeping above the water, starting to open, and seeing that as a symbol of the potential of human beings for enlightenment. So lotuses have come to symbolise human potential, the human potential for enlightenment in Buddhism. So the symbol of the jewel in the lotus, which is the title of the talk, represents the potential for growth and for enlightenment in all beings, including us, which is good news. So yes, three things that Avalokitesvara holds in his innermost arms: the jewel, the mala, and the lotus. But I want to explore the jewel symbol a bit more, because it's an incredibly important and powerful symbol. So in the Avalokitesvara myth, Avalokitesvara's broken body is put together around the jewel that he holds to his heart, his greatest wish, what he intends to devote his life to. And the Avalokitesvara myth is about, well, it's about how to live a human life. It's about how we can live our lives. It's about what we hold to our hearts and what we devote our lives to. Now, okay, we're ordinary, mundane, unenlightened, conditioned beings. We're lotuses with potential, but we're very much stuck in samsara, the ordinary, mundane, everyday world. But we do have a wish-fulfilling jewel, every single one of us, otherwise we wouldn't be here at all. We just need to find our jewel and clean it off and realise how important it is. And our jewel is our Shraddha, our vision of what we want our life to be about, our intuition that there's more to life, our longing for a better, kinder, wiser world, whatever, in a way, we hold closest to our hearts. So the third way of responding to suffering is Shraddha. Okay? And most of you have heard the term before. Shraddha is often translated, it's a Sanskrit word that is often translated as faith, but we prefer not to translate it as faith because faith kind of gives you the wrong impression about it. Because it's not faith in the sense of ideas we sign up to. It's just not an intellectual thing at all. Very much involves our hearts and our volition, our will, the way we act, the way we conduct ourselves. Sangha describes Shraddha as the response of our total being when what is ultimate in us meets what is ultimate in the universe. And traditionally, there are three aspects to Shraddha. And usually people's main experience of Shraddha, or their first way in, is usually one of these, although for quite a lot of us, it can be more than one or even all three. And the three ways into Shraddha are longing and loving and knowing. So three sorts of Shraddha. And the longing aspect of Shraddha is, well, I suppose in that we hold to our hearts a longing for a different way of being. We hold to our hearts the longing for enlightenment, the longing for wisdom and compassion, the longing for the arising of the bodhicitta, however you want to frame that, the longing for something different and something higher. And the loving aspect of Shraddha is when we hold to our heart things that we love. So we hold to our heart values that we love, beliefs that we love, actions that we love. So it's a kind of knowing what we love, loving the beautiful, seeing the beauty in things and wanting it, loving it. And the knowing aspect of Shraddha is when we hold to our hearts the things that we intuitively know are true, things that taste of freedom and happiness, things that we can see are conducive to happiness for ourselves and for other people too. So, as I say, people describe their experience of Shraddha differently, but usually they're related to one of these, and you might like to think about, well, which of those is my way into Shraddha? Do any of those resonate with me? Are there things that I long for? Do I hold those to my heart? Are there things that I love? Are there things that I just really know are true? So, I suppose that if we were being good Buddhists, if someone asks us the question, what do you hold to your heart? We could glibly say, well, I hold to my heart the idea of enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. And in a way, it's easy to say. But I wonder to what extent it's true. There are all sorts of things that we hold to our hearts, and quite often they'll be related to something higher. Quite often they'll be related to our highest ideals, to the reason that we came along to the Buddhist Centre, to our spiritual aspirations. But sometimes we might just need to see what the link is. So I'll leave you to think about that, and we might talk about that in the groups. I want to go on to say something more about Shraddha. Because Shraddha has miraculous qualities. Because its vision is transcendental, Shraddha links us to the vastness of reality itself. It helps us to see ourselves as part of a huge, amazing, interconnected reality, and all sorts of positive emotions will actually flow from that. So there's a sense in which it is Shraddha that gives our lives meaning and perspective and hope. So holding the wish-fulfilling jewel of Shraddha, well, in relation to Joyce, I just do what I can for her. I accept that I can't change the reality of her painful aging body. I help where I can. And I make less of my frustration and my discomfort at her suffering, and more of her ability to rejoice in a beautiful sunset seen from the window of her kitchen, or her determination to make pickled onions as Christmas presents for ourselves in her garden and her hairdresser. So it's a different way of responding. And there are many, many positive results that flow from Shraddha, from holding to your heart something that is really, really important to you. And actually holding something to your heart is not just a Buddhist ideal and a Buddhist phenomenon. It's a human ideal and a human phenomenon. And to illustrate that, I want to tell you a story that's based in a prison camp in the Second World War. So this story is based at Stalag 8A. It's a prisoner of war camp, and it's 1940. Stalag 8A is in Gorlitz in Silesia. It's on the German-Polish border. It had been built 10 years or so before as a Hitler youth camp, and it was built for a few thousand people for rallies. But in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, 15,000 Polish prisoners of war were crammed into Stalag 8. And as the war carried on, a few months later, in 1940, the Polish prisoners were taken from Stalag 8 and were trucked off to prison camps that were further from their native Poland. And the camp was prepared for the invasion of Belgium and France. So what was happening in May 1940 was the German Blitzkrieg had been launched, and the German armies had invaded both Belgium and France in two different places, and they were sending ahead their bombers. So their strategy was, we go ahead, we bomb the strategic cities, and we send the armies in to mop up behind, basically. And okay. So what they then did was they brought French and German prisoners into Stalag 8, and by the middle of 1940 there were 30,000 prisoners in Stalag 8A. It was very, very crowded. So yeah, not an unlikely setting for a story about dukkha, about suffering. It was full of very frightened prisoners and very edgy German guards. A lot of them were fairly new to war and soldiering. Language difficulties meant that communication was very, very difficult. There were a lot of problems, a lot of suspicion, a lot of misunderstandings. There were food shortages. There were shortages of medical supplies and medical expertise. There were shortages of fuel. And that was true for everywhere in Germany and in the countries that Germany was occupying. And prisoners of war were not of the highest priority. So there weren't a lot of supplies for the prisoner of war camp. And Silesia had very, very hard winters. As the year wore on, the prisoners there were beginning to get very, very cold. the meals that were served in the camp were a breakfast of a couple of hunks of bread, and prisoners were advised to keep a bit of it to go with the main meal of the day, which was served at lunchtime, which is a watery stew made of potatoes, cabbage and turnips, for which prisoners queued in long, long lines for many hours. So sometime in June 1940, 3 Frenchmen arrived there, and those 3 Frenchmen had already made friends. All 3, by chance, had been professional musicians about 6 months before this. They'd been called up after the declaration of war. They were sent with their divisions to defend Verdun in northeast France. They'd survived the bombing of Verdun, and they'd survived the fighting on the ground. And when the Germans, or rather when the French defence collapsed, then they were among the thousands of French soldiers who gave up their rifles to the Germans and were herded into some fields near Verdun while the Germans decided what they were going to do with them. So there were thousands of them in these fields near Verdun. And so they were living in fields surrounded by German guards. Very different conditions to the concert halls and rehearsal studios and teaching studios that had been their lives 6 months earlier. And the 3 found each other because of their common interest in music. There was a cellist called Etienne Pasquier. There was a pianist and composer called Olivier Messiaen. And there was an Algerian Jew who was a clarinetist. His name was Henry Akoka. Henry Akoka was a fairly remarkable character. He was described as an eternal optimist. And somehow, during all the fighting, he had managed to hang on to his clarinet. And when the other 2 bumped into him in this field outside of Verdun, Henry Akoka still had his clarinet with him. So, what do you hold closest to you? What do you hold next to your heart? Henry Akoka obviously held his clarinet pretty close to what was most important to him. So, ever the optimist, Akoka challenged Messiaen to write him a piece of music to play on the clarinet, which was the only instrument available amongst these thousands of soldiers. And so to pass the time, Messiaen did indeed compose a clarinet solo. And Akoka practiced it standing in the open field with Pasquier holding the music so he could read it. It must have been a very curious sight amongst the fear and the squalor of the makeshift prison camp. Very, very weird. And quite moving, really. Apparently, Akoka said he thought the music was very beautiful, but it was far too hard for him. Okay, so not very long after that, the French prisoners were shipped off to Stalag 8. And the three men, when they got to Stalag 8, did manage to make contact again. So they found each other in the prison camp. And they managed to stay in touch, and they looked out for each other in the camp. Pasquier later said that he'd been very lucky. His luck was to be put on kitchen duty. And kitchen duty was very, very fortunate, because if you worked on kitchen duty, then there was sometimes the opportunity to get an extra portion of food for yourself or your friends. And so he looked after Messiaen and Akoka in that way. And sometimes you got the opportunity to steal a potato and to sell it on the black market of the prison camp and make a bit of cash. And actually that was quite important to him, because he began to save some money. You'll find out later what he spent it on. He had they in a way had two strokes of luck. The first stroke of luck was that they heard that there was another musician in the camp. Okay, so there were 30,000 Frenchmen and Belgians in this camp, but they managed to find another musician. There was a violinist called Jean de Boulard, who somehow had got himself a violin in the prison camp. And the other stroke of luck was that they discovered that they had a guard who spoke fluent French. Karl Albert Brühl was a German who had a Belgian mother, and so he'd learnt French from his mother. And not only did he speak French, but he loved music. And the four musicians found that Brühl really wanted to help them to make music. So what Brühl did was he fixed the work rotas so that Messiaen had time to compose. He found him paper and pencils in a quiet corner of a barracks to allow Messiaen some time to compose. He persuaded some of the other officers to allow a group of prisoners to create a kind of theatre with a piano that happened to be in the camp. And when Pasquier, with his little savings, had a whip round amongst all the other prisoners and collected some money together, he got permission for Pasquier to go under armed guard to buy a cello in the local town. So they then had a quartet. They had a piano, a violin, a clarinet, and which one have I missed out? Cello. Cello, piano, violin, clarinet, yeah, that's it. So during the autumn and the winter of 1940, Messiaen was composing a quartet for all four of them to perform. And prisoners were beginning to put together something that was a bit like a theatre where they were going to perform it. So, on the freezing evening of the 14th of January, 1941, a very makeshift theatre, packed with hundreds of prisoners of war, surrounded by German guards, and with a front row reserved for German officers, heard the premiere performance of a piece of music called the Quartet for the End of Time. The temperature was many degrees below freezing. The German officers all wore their greatcoats and scarves, mufflers and gloves and hats. And to keep warm, the musicians wore pieces of discarded Polish army uniform that they'd found lying around the camp. Messiaen said later on that he had never had such a rapt audience, in spite of the conditions, and even though very many of those present, probably most of those present, had never heard classical music before. And if any of you have ever heard this piece of music, you will know that it's a very beautiful piece of music. It's dramatic, it's contemplative, it's poignant, it's devotional. The end of time of the title is eternity. It's transcendental reality beyond the confines of time and space, beyond the sufferings of the conditioned world, which must have been all too evident to Messiaen and his fellow musicians. So beyond suffering, at the end of time, Messiaen's music describes transcendental beauty, deep peace, and joy. So Messiaen was a devout Catholic. The music begins with an angel that heralds the end of time, the angel from the Apocalypse. And the quartet is about the Christian kingdom of God, the heaven that Messiaen held closest to his heart. And it contains two very, very beautiful, haunting and devotional movements about Jesus. The themes are about Jesus transcending time, so it's about the transcendental nature of Jesus. And, well, yes, it's about transcendence and reality and compassion. So it's the Christian equivalent to what we as Buddhists would call enlightenment. So that's the story of the composition of the piece of music. It's not quite the end of the story, so I will tell you what happened next. The concert was a great success. The prison officers enjoyed it, the prisoners enjoyed it, and the camp authorities gave the go-ahead for several more performances over the rest of the winter. And then one day, about 6 months later, at the end of a rehearsal, Brühl got the musicians together and told them that they were going to be sent back to France. They were absolutely amazed. And Brule told them, very officiously in a way, that, well, they were musician soldiers. And because they were musician soldiers, they had no guns when they were taken prisoner. And because they had no guns, they hadn't meant any harm to German soldiers. And because they meant no harm, then their arrests were a mistake and they could be released. So Brule, it was actually completely untrue. All of them had rifles that had been taken from them. But Brule had found a technicality on which he could get them released. So all of them were loaded into trucks that were departing for the Swiss border. They were going to be taken to Switzerland, and from there they could make their own way to France. And yeah, 4 of them were loaded up. 3 of them actually made it. Henry Akoka, at one stage on the journey, was detained by the guards because of his Jewish appearance, and he was sent back to the prison camp. But he wasn't going to let that defeat him. He made several more attempts to escape on the journey back, and eventually he did so by leaping from a moving train with his clarinet still tucked under his arm. And he actually made it back to Marseille in the south of France before the end of the war. And before the war had completely ended, he was playing again with his old orchestra in Marseille. So, yeah, the connection between this story and Avalokitesvara. Well, in a way, the connection between the story and Avalokitesvara is the wish-fulfilling jewel. Without a purpose in his life, Messiaen and his fellow musicians would probably just have been 4 prisoners of war suffering the discomforts and fears of life in a prison camp, along with 30,000 others in the same boat. But Messiaen placed his spiritual vision at the centre of his life, and he expressed that vision through music. And I've got no idea whether the other 3 were religious. It seems to me that they obviously placed at the centre of their hearts, or very close to it, the creation of beauty through music. So all 4 of them had something that they held close to their hearts. And because of what these men held to their hearts, all sorts of positive consequences just flowed. They created beauty and happiness in the midst of squalor and hardship. They triggered acts of generosity in other prisoners, and great kindness and generosity in the guard, Brule. And actually one account of the story says that Brule actually forged the release papers for them, in which case that his act of kindness was also an act of extreme courage. So I'm not making any spiritual claims for Messiaen, but he was obviously a force for good in that prison camp. He moved the universe in a positive direction, and that's what Shraddha does. That's what happens when we hold what's most important closest to our hearts. Holding to our vision gives us a direction, and because our lives are no longer just about our own comfort and happiness, we're able to stay more positive much more of the time, even when the circumstances of our own lives are difficult, even when we're suffering ourselves, even when we're surrounded by the suffering of others. And because of that, we have a beneficial effect on others. Our ability to be creative just sends ripples out into the world of beauty and inspiration and happiness and hope and kindness and courage. Rather like the hands of Avalokitesvara reaching out to the world while he holds the wish-fulfilling jewel of the bodhicitta to his heart. So that's the myth and the symbolism of Avalokitesvara, and a bit about the jewel of Shraddha. The jewel of Shraddha, that's the key to positive emotion, and that helps us respond to the suffering of the world without getting overwhelmed by it. So, I suggest that